Good afternoon, everybody that's joining us on this side of the Atlantic. If you're tuning in from the East Coast of the US, good morning to you. We are going to talk this afternoon about comms in the boardroom. Now, the role of the comms director has changed and definitely grown over the past few years, since the proliferation of platforms on which to communicate have also grown. And the reputation of the business that we as comms directors are representing has never been more important. And we need to understand that our role in helping that reputation flourish has never been more vital. So for comms to be a boardroom discipline would seem to be a no-brainer, but it isn't completely the case. So how can we move comms into that stratosphere of the boardroom? Where should our ambition take us? And I'm joined for this conversation this afternoon by two absolute doyens of comms and marketing, legends in EssenceMediacom and VMLY&R. Claire Ferguson, who is a Group Director of Marketing at EssenceMediacom, and Beth Wade, Global Chief Marketing Officer at VMLY&R. Good afternoon, both of you. Thank you for joining us. The first question I want to ask, and I'd like to pose it first to you, Claire, is what's really, you've been now at EssenceMediacom, as you're saying, for 23 years, amazing career, many roles within that, but what has influenced your approach to comms during that period?
Hi, Rose. Thank you for inviting me to take part in this today. So I think it's a really interesting question. My career hasn't been linear from a point of view of it being just in comms or marketing. I think that's probably true of Beth, which she may come on to talk about in a little bit. There's quite an interesting sort of synergy there. I have been at EssenceMediacom, previously Mediacom legacy for a long time. It's actually 21 years, but still pretty good stint. And I was previously at Omnicom, and I think that actually having that zigzag approach to my career, so having been head of client services and head of planning in the past, I've worked in market as well. I'm now in a global role, has helped me in the boardroom and has helped me with this role, because it's really helped me understand the agency operating model in a way that I think that if I'd just been kind of siloed to a degree in communications or marketing all the way through, that I wouldn't necessarily understand the nuance of all the different aspects of the business. I think that's been the first thing. I think the second thing is I've been really lucky to have a lot of amazing sort of mentors and female role models, particularly throughout my career. And specifically a lot of them are kind of Mediacom legacy people. So people like Kate Rowlingson, Claudine Collins, C. Uniman and Karen Blackett. And really they've kind of been, it's a phrase that Karen uses quite a lot, but cheerleaders, if you like, throughout. But when I've had problems, they've been people that I can go to as well and have a real sort of sounding board. And so I think I've been quite lucky in that personally. So they're sort of the main things, I think.
And have you hit, it's great to have that mentorship. What are some of the challenges you faced in that time?
Being totally honest, and it's probably not a very, I don't know whether this is a popular answer or not, because I think sometimes working women who have families kind of don't want to talk about this, but I'm happy to. I have definitely at different pinch points in my career experienced pressures where I can't kind of get the blend of work or the kind of needs and wants of my family life to balance. And I think because I've had those role models in my career, I've been able to have people to go to as sounding boards, and we've been able to flex, whether that's moving into different roles, for example, changing the clients that I might be leading or changing my working pattern. There's always been a kind of open and honest, transparent conversation about that, particularly when my children were a lot younger. They're teenagers now, which is a different set of challenges. But that's been really helpful to me. And so what I try to do now is I mentor as many people as I can as well, just so that I'm kind of giving back some of what I've had, out of my career.
And just paying that forward, that's a really important thing, isn't it? And Beth, I'd love to bring you in now just to talk about, you've also been, I think, at VMLY&R 16 years, or have I got that right?
20.
Over 20.
A part of WPP for 23.
Wow. So that's two almost lifers in the in the business. That is fantastic. And so what for you have been the big influences as you've moved through the business?
Yes, I would say, and Claire, you pointed this out. I think we've had very like-minded kind of career progressions and things that we've done. And I think that has really helped in the sense of where I'm at today from a communications leadership perspective. So I started on the client side prior to WPP. So I was the client, I was working with agencies, I was doing that. So I understood, from a perspective of what a client is looking for, what we are presenting to them, how do we show up in meetings, what's the narrative that we are speaking to. But then as I got into VMLY&R, I was running client service for quite some time, started out in client service and then ultimately ran that department. And so when you're doing that, you've had insight into what clients are looking for, how you tell your story. And so I think having that client perspective is super, super important from a communications perspective for us, because there's a lot of noise out there. So we have to cut through, right? And we have to understand, what is the marketing landscape? What does it look like? How are we showing up? What is the storytelling we put to it? What's the differentiator? And what is the white space that we have to create something new with these clients? So I do believe that client focus is super important to a communications role.
I think you're right about that white space. I think in the industry that we're in, there are the same topics and focuses, and trying to find and then communicate your point of view and how that is different or nuanced from the rest is always, I think, for me, one of the great challenges that I think we love to embrace as comms professionals. And I just want to stick with you there, Beth, because I know to talk a little bit about the influence then that comms and marketing can have on leadership and decision making, and whether you think that's changed for the better. And I know you have, and just also thinking from that client perspective, I think you also said that you need to think holistically about this. You can't just work in isolation. You've got to think about the ecosystem.
Yes. And I think that, Rose, from a title perspective, it was, how do you get in the boardroom or influence in the boardroom? You have to be on the board. And I think that is an important piece, and probably an evolution that's happened over the last few years, is that comms professionals are sitting at the table, because we have an insight to see everything, as you said, holistically. We can understand how every part of our organization is working, whether that be the capabilities that we have, the culture that we're creating, the communities that we need. And I think we have a perspective that many don't have, because we see everything and we are responsible for bringing that story to life. And so we can give feedback on where we may have opportunities, where we have weaknesses, and I think help craft that. So I'd say be on the board.
Yeah, and I think that's we'll talk in a little while about how we can practically make that happen and move that dial. Claire, just on that kind of connection point as well, what's your view about the influence that comms has, and as increasingly has, on making that connectivity work inside the business as well as outside the business? And I know you've, most recently with the launch of EssenceMediacom, there've been all those touch points to think about.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think Beth's point's absolutely key. It's so important. I think that the comms people having a seat at the table is very important in any operation organisation. And I think that it does come down to that audience empathy point, and that kind of walking a mile in your audience's shoes, whether that is existing clients, prospective clients, employees, the rest of the people around that boardroom table, the industry at large, whatever. And I think that it brings that focus in. I mean, I think back to your question, though, specifically, Rose, I think it's just really positive that comms has got that influence now in a way that it didn't have. It didn't have that influence. I mean, I came into this role 10 years ago from client service, also, Beth, and it didn't have that influence, and it's slowly grown over time. And I think that it's been intensified because of things that are probably external to the businesses that we work in. So external factors to do with society, war, pandemic, and also expectations of the current kind of workforce generation, which I think are quite different probably. And I think that, therefore, great comms professionals bring brilliant insights from all those audiences to the boardroom. And also, it's really good for comms people to be able to see that their careers can progress in the same way that other, senior leadership team members or exco team members can progress. So there isn't a kind of, you don't have that ceiling thing, which I think in the past arguably did exist. But, I think that it's definitely true that effective communication plays a crucial role in leadership and decision making across our agencies, our industry, but also across all of our clients as well. And we're increasingly seeing that with all of our CMO clients.
And I think there's that point about emotional intelligence, isn't there? That is such an important part. And linked to that, the idea not just of letting the inside of the business out, not being afraid to and being conscious of your audience. You say your audience can be shareholders at one end, but it's going to be talent at the other end and clients externally. What's your view about the kind of the importance that the kind of the EQ that comms brings into leadership? Beth, what's your view here?
Well, I think you could focus it's just purely on the word communications. I mean, everyone wants to feel like they are hearing things, they're a part of a system, they are aware of what's happening. And I think, just to Claire's point, that emotional intelligence, that empathy that we have, the grace to tell people where we're going, it is super important for us to be the leaders there in making sure that our organizations are aware of where we're heading, even troubles that we've had, and very, very clear communication and transparency. And I think, to your point, Rose, especially with some of the younger generation, transparency is so key. It's very different than, I think, when I started out. I mean, things happen in a boardroom and that's where they stayed. Now it's, conversations are happening in the boardroom, but we're having an agency meeting to talk about it. And there is transparency into what we're doing and how we're acting. And I think that is extremely important to be successful today.
That's right. And that transparency is a massive shift, I think. But at the same time, there perhaps is still a danger of the day-to-day getting in the way of the long term. So how can we keep everyone's focus, not least leadership, on those kind of big goals rather than short-term execution, the kind of important things rather than the things that then become urgent things? And kind of what kind of person do you need to be able to drive that? And Claire, I know you've got very, very keen views on the kind of person that you need to be. I think we all agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting. I think that there's something really interesting, actually, Rose, that we've talked about recently that I think is important to this, which is just about making sure that you've got a really good balance from a boardroom point of view of different communication types, different capability and skill sets, and that kind of table is, I guess, kind of as a whole team functioning as a one, if that makes sense. So that's something that you and I have sort of talked about in the past. And I think that's really important. I think that I've got kind of a lot of operational points of view on this, which might probably maybe feel less strategic, but essentially I think that you have to make the time for both things, because it is really easy in our roles, Beth, I don't know whether you agree, to kind of get very distracted by the urgent and the churn and the things that are kind of happening day to day. And there's always a crisis somewhere in the client world or agency world or wherever we're kind of, operating. And I think it is very important to make sure that you keep clear delineation of now and next is kind of the language that I use with my team and that we use operationally from an EssenceMediacom point of view as well. I mean, we've got a structure ourselves at EssenceMediacom which separates strategic decisions from day-to-day operational decisions. And it means that the global leadership team and also the local market leadership teams come together regularly to talk just about strategy. And that's quite tightly organised and orchestrated, which I think really helps. I mean, obviously for us, we've also been merging with a sister agency. So as you mentioned earlier, Rose, and that's been quite chaotic at times, being totally honest. But I think that it is important when you look across like a week or a month to always think about how's the balance been from a sort of current task, what's on fire that day, versus where our focus has been for sort of future objectives. One of the things that we use is just regular sort of team retrospectives to make sure that the balance between those two things is happening. And sometimes, being really honest, it doesn't, but as long as you're kind of having that conversation, you're sort of making the time and space to kind of analyze, has this happened? Is this happening enough? No, right, let's course correct. Then I think that's how you kind of you operate in that way. But it is an incredibly important point.
No, that's a really good point. And Beth, I'd like to bring you in on this, because if you are, I know that you've talked before about the comms being the driver for change, or can be the driver for change. And so how do you help turn those words into action, and how do you move that along at senior level?
Yeah, so there are a few examples of that, and from our perspective, first of all, we are always looking towards the future. It is, what is our 3-year, 5-year plan, and we are focused on where we need to go, both from how we are operating as a community, how we are operating as a culture, but then how are we progressing to meet the needs of our clients. And so those are always top of mind for us, and we have some things that actually help us facilitate that throughout the year. So, of course, we do have global leadership team meetings where we are getting together with capability leads, office leads, et cetera, around the world, talking about the current landscape of where are we going to go and how do we actually all hold hands in getting there? What are the ways that we can lean on each other? We of course have, agency meetings, and one that we have in February of every year is our annual meeting. And that is the time where we are bringing to everyone at our team around the world, what is the vision? And so there is a dedicated time every year that we are explaining where we are going as a community, as an agency, to 13,000 people around the world. So as a comms leader, it's imperative for me to make sure that that is clearly communicated, that we have a vision, that people are inspired and excited about what is next. And so that to me is something that we can always count on. Everyone knows it's going to happen. And so just having some of those, shall we say, markers in your year where you need to deliver what is going to be the communication to your team members is extremely important. And if you don't have those on a calendar today, put them on, because it helps you move forward and progress, and actually not only, shall we say, build up the things that are to come, but fix the issues you have today.
Yeah, that's true. And I absolutely agree with that idea, like getting it in the calendar, getting that focus. And I suppose also the turning words into action, people understanding what their role is in all of that. So they're not simply observers being communicated to, but they understand the part they have to play.
Definitely.
So that lovely phrase we have, forgiveness rather than permission. There are times when you need to act swiftly. There is a process for approval. It can be quite slow, but the bridge is burning over here, or an opportunity that we want to jump on. How do you think that as an approach helps Boardroom cut through? And particularly, I know both of you are part of a holding company, the same holding company. How do you kind of navigate some of that process and retain your agency's voice? And I'll start with you, Beth, on this one.
So, forgiveness rather than permission. Let's start there. I mean, that can take a lot of different ways it's coming to life. I would say, really what you have to have is a close team that's willing and able to work with that agility. And, if we have something coming up and we need to get something done, we have a tight group that are making decisions and going through the risks, the opportunities, but doing it on the fly and knowing we have to get things out. So nothing is done in a vacuum, I would say. So that is key. Have your teammates identified that you can make decisions as a team. I mean, it sounds simple, but you need to have different perspectives weighing in on what's going to happen, but you need to move with agility. So that would be one. As far as within WPP, we have great relationships. I'm sure Claire does as well. I can pick up the phone at any time and talk to our comms partners at WPP. And we do, if there are situations of which are coming up and we know they're going to have impact beyond our operating company, beyond our agency. We are, again, working collectively, working quickly, and making those decisions as a whole. So very important to create relationships of trust and those that you can quickly get to answers together.
Claire, you agree with that?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think Beth's point about relationships across the board is really important. So not just within the agency operating model that you're in, whether that is, as we talked before about with clients, for example, or whether that's about with sort of sister opcos and our holding companies. And obviously we work within WPP as well. So it's very similar to Beth's experience, but we also have Group M from an investment point of view. And we work very closely with them as well. So it's a similar kind of relationship. I think, though, kind of striking the right balance between being punchy and sort of navigating politics is always a constant tightrope that we walk as communication experts, if that makes sense. I mean, for me, I feel that there isn't really a one size fits all, because I think it just depends on what that specific challenge is. And as Beth said, often it is just picking up the phone and having a conversation. And everybody that we work with from a Group M and WPP point of view, and with our sister opcos, we've all got brilliant relationships, and everyone works pretty agile and very fluid in the same way that Beth describes. I think I have a personal approach to these scenarios. I always think it's important to be as transparent as possible, follow gut instincts, be open and honest and clear about intentions, and also be willing to walk away. So, that kind of thing of not knocking your head against a brick wall too many times. If you're kind of not aligned and you don't agree, then actually at a certain point in time, walking away and finding another way through. So I think the balance between those things is important, but being flexible and staying really true to your own personal and your team's guiding principles allows you to kind of navigate those challenges, usually successfully, hopefully, for all parties.
So pick your fight, although I wouldn't say fight, because obviously it's a highly collaborative collaborative environment.
Yeah, exactly. Pick your discussion.
Yeah, I guess understand what the priorities are, and they can change day to day. I think also there's what seems so urgent at the time, actually, if you look at it in a different perspective, or you look at it in a bigger context, isn't necessarily important. And it's kind of part of our skill and our day-to-day challenge to balance all of that out.
And to that point, Rose, is quite interesting, because I often find that just a little bit of time, even if it's an overnight or a weekend or whatever, it can just totally flip your perspective. So yeah, I agree with that.
I remember years ago trying to negotiate a sponsorship, and there was a fundamental misunderstanding between the organization. This is an course angling sponsorship, between the organization who was running the sport and our client. And I remember being on the phone for ages to the president, and I remember him saying, "I'm relying on you, Miss Cameron," as I was then. And I said, "Well, let's just think about it overnight and come back." And I thought by the morning we would have figured out some way through. And in the morning, I think he'd had the opportunity to have a chance with his comms director, who just said, "What you've got to understand, it's just PR that we're doing this for. It doesn't mean we've got to shift the goal tomorrow. We can figure all that out." So just in that overnight, they'd managed to have this conversation. And then he also apologized for calling me young lady, which I thought was really nice. So yeah, just perspectives can absolutely shift. But I guess certain perspectives that are shifting all the time are around the big topics in comms at the moment, the hot topics: sustainability, and of course inclusion, DE&I. How do you kind of lead leadership on these topics? How do you sort of help them navigate around these issues and evolve what the point of view is? Beth, what are your top tips here?
Well, first of all, I would say that a relationship between the communications team and the people team is essential to success. And again, I think if you dial back 10 years ago to when we both got into communications, we were fairly siloed, right? There was HR and there were communications, and now they're connected. We need to make sure that we are integrated. So that relationship between the people team and the communications team is essential, because everything that we're going to do on behalf of equity, inclusion, belonging is going to take both of us working together. And then again, it's going to take both of us to say, how can we bring this to our clients? And what is the difference for them? How are we showing up in meetings? How is the team that is working on their account going to be different? How do we make sure that the work that we're creating is inclusive in nature? These are all things that we have to work on collectively as a group. And so that partnership is essential. I'll start there.
I think that's great. And I think, Claire, you've got these big issues which are discussed globally, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you take always a global approach. Would that be true?
Yeah, totally. So I think it's really interesting because I think that it's very different depending on which territory. So Beth was previously in a UK role, and I've been working on global business in the last year. So I'm seeing a lot of variation depending on which market we're talking about. I mean, we're in 96 countries globally. I'm sure it's probably very similar to VMLY&R as well. And I think it does vary massively. I mean, my kind of overarching view on this is I agree with what Beth said about the relationship between the people team and the communications office. I think it's really, really important. I think it's really important at a global level, but it's also, to your point, Rose, really important locally, because I think there are massive nuances culturally in countries and in regions globally that have to be taken into account. I also think that it's really important that it's everyone's consideration and everyone's objective, and not just sitting with the people team and the communications team. So I think, making sure that there are clear KPIs for every single person in leadership roles and everyone in the operation in an agency around these areas is the only way that you actually really drive change. So that would kind of be the other build that I'd put on top of the relationship point. I think there has to be control at local level, because I think the cultural differences can be so big. You have to kind of have that voice locally as well as globally.
I love that, Claire. And I would just say you made a great point there in the sense that we can set a strategy, we can set an approach, but it's going to take every department lead. It's going to take office leads. It's going to take the team meetings to make that happen. So it's not about us sending an email and expecting things to flow. It's about real conversations and accountability at a variety of levels.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think also where do you start? It'd be interesting to understand from both of you, what do you think is that biggest issue that you are developing those strategies for globally and locally at the moment? Is it more around inclusion? Is it gender balance? Is it the kind of sustainability, climate change? Is it the kind of all the macroeconomic factors we're facing? Or is it something more, brand specific? What are the key things that are the big topics of discussion internally for you at the moment?
Well, how about all of the above? Because everything you just listed is top of mind, but it does change market to market, right? So, I think if it's hard to believe the pandemic started 3 years ago, and look at what we went through over 3 years, the social injustice, war, et cetera, that happened during that time. We've had to come up with strategies for specific markets and really, as you say, have a global approach. People aware of what's happening at a global level, but locally, how are we activating? And so every single thing that you spoke about is something we're grappling with, at a market to market level.
Claire, what about you?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think all of those things. I think we've got a sort of different set of challenges like layered over at the moment, which actually are probably more internal because of the merge of the two agencies. So there's a kind of an understanding of our vision and proposition piece that has to happen. And what Beth was talking about actually with the previous question is really important to that. So making sure that you kind of have ongoing regular communication with everybody, and that has to happen from a sort of global point of view, but also needs to be happening on a local market basis as well on a regular basis. And I think that, so we've kind of got an extra layer to those things. All those things are true and are absolutely important to us, and we're looking at them. But I think that that for us, the additional thing is just kind of making sure that all of our people are on the same journey with the understanding of where we're going from a sort of a new vision and proposition point of view. Just an added layer to add to the day job.
No easy task, Claire.
No.
Yeah.
No, love those layers.
I started to feel quite scared as I was saying that. I was like, oh, why am I talking about this? It's quite uncomfortable.
We've all gone through it.
Well, we're going to be running out of time shortly, unbelievably, but I do have one final question I'd like to ask. And also, as I am, and neither of you might know this about me, a big Game of Thrones fan. And in the very, very final episode, the Seven Kingdoms or the Six Kingdoms was given to Bran the storyteller, because the point was made that while some contenders to the throne can be warlike and some can be scheming, the person that always wins out is the teller of stories. So given that that was Bran's ticket to leadership in Game of Thrones, I'd just like to ask you about whether you believe comms leadership can be a stepping stone to CEO. We'll have a lot of people at this conference who are at varying degrees in their career. What's the path to that, do you think? And how do you need to think about it and strategize about it? Claire, I'm going to start with you.
So I think it's a great analogy actually, Rose. And I didn't know about the Game of Thrones thing, but I did enjoy the last few series of it, not necessarily the first few. I sort of got more into it as it went along. Look, I think it can be a stepping stone to a CEO role. I don't think that was true when I came into the role 10 years ago. I don't think it always is, but I think it can be. And I think that that's brilliant, because to the point of not having a kind of ceiling, I guess, in this role for anybody that is involved in the conference today, that's really motivating and encouraging. So it's much more likely now than it ever was in the past. And I think that that can only be a good thing. I do think that comms backgrounds brings unique benefits to this to a leadership role, whether that's CEO or COO, understanding of the importance of communication, audience engagement, and reputation management, all these things, but also all of Beth's points about the different audiences that we're sort of navigating, and making sure that you're kind of walking that mile in your client's shoes all the time, and also thinking about your people. I think for those listening with CEO ambitions, my top tips would be broaden your role beyond comms. So if you come into your organization with just comms experience, get some experience that isn't just comms, because I think that can only help you. It might not mean that you get there more quickly, but it would mean that when you're in that role that you're kind of set up for it a lot better. So embrace horizontal career development, because you need to understand every aspect of the organization operation that you work in to be brilliant at comms, or to be a sort of CEO person. And lastly, I wish anyone good luck in pursuing that role, because I think it's a challenging position to attain and sustain, but obviously very highly rewarding as well.
Thank you. Beth, what are your thoughts?
Well, I completely agree with Claire. The one piece that I would just say from a specificity perspective is working on a client. I think that it is imperative, if we are looking to be the next CEO and you're going through comms, you have to have the experience on how you're creating, how you're delivering, how you're explaining, how you're, there are hard discussions you have to have with clients. There are easy ones too. But I think that as a team, as a leader, you have to be able to have those conversations to build that trust, to build those relationships. And I think that it is imperative that you have experience directly with clients, not on the side helping to get the news out, but actually creating the work alongside them. And that would be the tip I'd have, just as you said, Claire, to those who are starting out in their career. It's okay. It's not a ladder. I mean, the different experiences that we have will help you build a a better perspective on how to deliver the work. So embrace change and embrace different opportunities.
That's a lovely note to finish on. And I think this has been a fantastic conversation. I think some of the key takeaways for me are this idea, like, we've never as comms professionals been here for lip service. We've been about driving change. And that change comes from putting your audiences at the heart of everything we do and bringing that perspective along with healthy doses of EQ into the boardroom. Any final tips you would have for the audience on how they might tackle any challenge that they might have over the coming year? An old client of mine talked about the PR curve, that there's going to be highs and then there'll be lows, and there's going to be both, and you have to navigate them. What are your, just to finish on, what are your top tips for resilience?
Personally, I would say humor and relationships. So nurture relationships and, look after those people that you've got good relationships with in your team, around you, your support network. Create support networks for other people. Put in as much as you get out. And humor always helps, particularly in a crisis.
Excellent. HR then, I guess. Humor and relationships. Beth?
I would just add on to that by saying, always be a student. We are here to learn. And so, sometimes we're all facing something for the first time together, but in many cases that you can go and you can understand what's been done in the past, what's worked and what hasn't. So be a student, be always learning, look for different ways to broaden your horizon and broaden your perspective and what you're bringing to your team. So continue to learn.
Thank you. Both ladies, Claire, Ferguson, Beth Wade, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you both for joining us.
Rose, thank you.
Thank you, Rose.